US Special Envoy. John Kerry, thank you very much for talking to Sky News.
Happy to be with you.
You have been engaged in an extraordinary period of global diplomacy. Is the international community where you want it to be, just weeks ahead of COP26?
Well, we've made progress, and I'm convinced that COP26 will produce an increase in ambition globally, but we are not yet where the science tells us we need to be in terms of the level of that ambition. So it's rising. We're waiting for some key countries to come in with revised NDCs, which is their level of stated reductions, and we're hopeful. But there's still work to be done.
Which countries are you referring to? Because in your speech you said that there were some nations engaged in delivering BS. That's what you said to the young activists. Which countries did you mean?
Well, there are countries that have, in some cases, I'm not going to get into country for country, but there are some that regrettably have just not been completely forthcoming in terms of the levels of reduction that they're making. And one of the issues that we're discussing in the context of the negotiation is transparency and accountability. So that is not yet a closed conversation. It's ongoing, but most of us believe we have to have very significant transparency with real accountability so that we're all in the same boat. We're all looking at the standards in the same way. That's the fairest way to measure what is happening. And I think that's what ultimately we will wind up with. But look, we're all in this together. Every country has got to come together. We know in terms of BS that certain private sector entities over the last 30 years have fudged what they're doing.
Talking about big oil.
I'm talking about some companies that are involved in the provision of energy who have not been candid and who hid even their own information regarding the science and regarding what they knew about the impact of global climate. So, you know, we want everybody to step up now. This is not a moment for recrimination, it's a moment for cooperation, and that's what we're hoping will take place.
On that, are you confident that the group of 20 nations, including China, Russia, India, and others, can come to an agreement about the phase out of coal for domestic use in time for COP26?
Well, I think that what people can come to agreement on is the need urgently to not have unabated production facilities where you're not capturing the carbon. Coal, it seems to me, the marketplace has already made its decision about coal. No bank in Europe, no bank in America, and now possibly anywhere because of China's recent decision not to fund coal externally. I think that'll have a pretty profound impact on the readiness of finance to be available for coal. So the marketplace is making a decision about coal, not us specifically, but now you have cheaper and cleaner forms of energy. And that's where many countries are going to go.
But Alok Sharma has said that he wants to use COP26 to consign coal to history. In your view, is that going to be possible? We've only got days to go.
I think that the COP process will clearly define that coal is going to be reduced very significantly and ultimately will not be a fuel of option for countries anywhere.
And you expect China and India and Russia and others to be happy about that?
Well, they're not going to do that immediately, obviously. They have big plants that they've already put in place, and some of them are new, and I'm afraid some of them are going to be around for a while. So the key to that is the abatement. They've got to be able to capture the carbon and put it somewhere. And I think the requirements globally are going to be increasing, that people are going to have to transition out of that into some other form of providing energy. And now we know absolutely clearly, without any question, that alternative, renewable, sustainable energy is cheaper than the provision of coal. So just in the market terms, it's going to begin to be reduced significantly. But obviously, coal is the principal source of the worst damage of the climate crisis. And it hugely affects people's lives on a daily basis all around the world. We lose 10 million people a year who die because of pollution. And the principal pollution that is involved in that is coal.
Are strained US-China relations making it harder for you to do your job and convince China to be more ambitious?
The answer is yes. It's been more complicated because of other issues, which originally our leaders defined as being outside of the entire lane of climate. Climate was going to be treated on its own because of its urgent demands. But reality has crept in the last few months. And so there's been a slowdown in our ability to be able to move. I hope now that's going to move. I think that our presidents, President Xi, President Biden, had a very constructive conversation. They did talk about cooperating and how we could begin to find a way forward. And I think there will be further discussions that tackle some of the other issues between us in an effort to try to change the dynamic, change the relationship for the better. One of the places where we can make the greatest amount of progress and coordination quickly would be climate. And my hope is that we will still be able to find some common ground. I will be meeting with my counterpart from China shortly, and we are both hopeful that we can make some progress.
Do you fear that China will use the importance of tackling the climate crisis as leverage for increasing its power in relations with the US?
Well, I think President Xi is very concerned about climate, and he is personally engaged in all the decisions that are being made about climate. And I know President Xi has, for some period of time, been deeply concerned and wants to try to move forward on that. So my hope is that we will be able to get some things done before the COP. I can't guarantee it.
Like what?
Well, we're going to continue to discuss the question of the next decade and what we can do to try to reduce emissions and treat this like the emergency it is. But it would certainly not be to China's interest to say, we're going to cut off our nose to spite our face, which would be the equivalent of saying, you know, we're not going to deal with you on this issue because we have this other issue, because the fact is that not dealing with climate is damaging to China itself and is a cost for their citizens who will not have cleaner air and not have the safety of a long-term future that comes by addressing the climate crisis. I think President Xi knows that. He doesn't want to get caught up in that, I hope. And my hope is we'll find some common ground.
What message will it send to the rest of the world, though, if President Xi does not turn up to COP26 in person?
Well, I can't, I think...
You must be concerned about that.
No, I haven't really thought about it very much, to be truthful with you. I think 190 some countries will come, and if there are 194 and not 195, there still would be a representation, and it's not going to be defined by whether President Xi himself. I think it's better for President Xi to come. I hope he does come. I think it'd be great for him to show the world that, China's at the table and at the highest level, and he's going to make announcements. I think that's for the better. But I don't think the COP will be deterred in doing its business if 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 leaders decide they're not going to get there. I think it's not the best thing, but this COP is going to go forward, and I think the vast majority of countries in the world are very anxious to be part of a moment where we really turn a corner and we're heading in the right direction on the climate crisis.
Why should developing nations, in particular with a higher reliance on fossil fuels, listen to nations like the UK and the US when they continue to grant permits to drill for oil and gas on their own soil?
Well, we should not be doing new projects in the judgment of many of us. And I think what President Biden has said is he's not going to allow any public lands to be used. But some companies have leases that they secured a long time ago. We're not going to be off of oil and gas by tomorrow or next week or even next year, even as we're reducing. So it's not completely illogical that there's going to be a continuation to some degree. That's a transitional process. It's going to happen over the next 30 years. We have to get about a 50%, 45 to 50% reduction in the next 10 years. But that doesn't mean zero instantly. So the key is, are you on a track that gets you to the 45% minimum reduction in the next 10 years, and that gets you to net zero by 2050. That's what the science says. We're being guided by science here, not politics, not ideology, but arithmetic and physics, and the conclusions scientists have drawn about both of those. So we will have gas being used as an alternative for some number of years. Gas is a quick 50% reduction in emissions from coal or oil, but unabated, that is. But we need to do better. We're going to continue to be pushing, and I'm confident you'll see a continued tightening. President Biden has decided, by the way, and not a small incidental thing, that by 2035, the United States will be carbon-free in all of its power sector. So that means no gas, no oil, no coal, a power sector that is exclusively on renewable and emissions-free energy.
But Boris Johnson, the UK government, is continuing to grant new licenses to drill in the North Sea. Is that the right thing to do in your view?
Well, I don't know what the time period is or the actual details of that calculation. I think in general, we should heed the advice of the IEA, which is not to have new fossil fuel projects that take you into a long-term future. We've got to be paring down, we've got to be shifting, no question about it.
To what extent does it make your job trickier when, at home in the US, members of Congress are struggling to even agree to vote on a vast spending bill that contains critical cash for combating climate change?
Well, having spent 28 years in the Senate, I understand something about the cross currents and the flow, if you will, the ebb and flow of congressional action. What happened today or yesterday or may happen tomorrow does not govern what the final outcome will be. It affects the negotiating process. It affects the paring down of a piece of legislation. The sausage making is not pretty. But in the end, they're going to have a sausage, I believe. And my hope is that it includes the critical components of what we need to be able to deal with the climate crisis. But always the legislative prerogatives are such that you will see compromise and changes, one thing given up for one thing accepted, and you really can't make a judgment about it until you get to the final votes.
I want to talk a little bit about moral authority in the United Kingdom. And in a recent speech, Prime Minister Boris Johnson rather flippantly and jokingly referred to some aspects of combating the climate crisis as bunny hugging. And Greta Thunberg used her speech in Milan to use that as an illustration of a lack of seriousness. Do you fully trust that Boris Johnson is the right person to help lead the global fight against the climate crisis?
Well, the proof is in the pudding, right? In the eating of the pudding, and we'll get there. I think this is not a matter of trust in the sense that we're making judgments about whether we trust this or trust that. He's committed to this, and he's publicly doing major things in order to try to make this work. And I've been impressed by the statements he's made to date, committing his government and the world to take action, and I think he's offering leadership. But in the end, we have to get there, and it's the doing, it's the actions all of us, by the way, same thing for the United States. I'm not asking somebody to trust us right now. We're asking you to take note of what we're doing and trying to do and what we're going to do. And that's what will determine, what should determine the judgments people will make about Glasgow and what happens there. Let's make that judgment at the end of the 2 weeks of our negotiations.
As the Western world transitions away from fossil fuels, it's going to require a huge investment, as you have often said. That will mean as well for ordinary people that in the short term they might face higher bills as they change their vehicles, as they change the heating systems in their homes, as perhaps they pay more for fossil fuel-based energy. Do you have sympathy with them when they say that's a price I'm not willing to pay?
Sure, I have huge sympathy with people all over the world who've been economically pressed by a process that has increasingly created greater and greater inequality in the world, that has hugely broadened the divide between haves and have-nots. And in our own country, I'll talk about my own country, we have a completely unfair tax structure that needs overhauling. That's not my bailiwick right now. That's not in my lane, so to speak. You know, many people have spoken to this unfairness. Donald Trump spoke to it and appealed to it in a certain way. And President Biden is addressing it in his legislation right now that is trying to address this inequality and try to bring things back together a little bit. But it does enter into the question of environmental justice and the fairness with which this entire effort to deal with climate is hopefully, not hopefully, must not contribute to the divide, must be sensitive to the realities of life for people all around the world. Now, that said, properly implemented, if we do this the right way, this should not mean economic dislocation, and it should not mean hardship for people who have to make choices about how to get to work and, you know, driving their family to the doctor and so forth. What people are looking at here is the development and the support for alternatives that make life better. We lose 10 million people a year to pollution, greenhouse gases, to the CO2 that falls into the ocean, raises the acidity of the ocean, warms the ocean. The warming, 90% of the heat that's rising on the planet goes into the ocean. So all of these things actually raise the costs for people every day. We've spent billions upon billions of dollars in the United States of taxpayer money to do what? To clean up after a storm, to fight fires, to take the mud away after a big mudslide that killed people, to deal with the problem of floods that have destroyed the crops of farmers. We have about $50 billion of cost annually for children who are hospitalized in America due to environmentally induced asthma. That comes from the dirty air, from the pollution. So there are better alternatives here to deal with day-to-day life challenges that do not require that the average person in the world is going to have to pay more for these. The more we adopt the efforts to deploy electric vehicles, the faster the price is going to come down, the more affordable it's going to become.
But in the short term, people are going to have to pay perhaps more out of pocket.
Well, right now, today, as you and I are talking, they're paying a hell of a lot more for gas, right? And that's because we're not providing enough alternatives for, for fuel that in fact would be affordable right now. For instance, green hydrogen, or provision of electricity, transition faster to electric vehicles. So you're not dependent on gas and gas prices that chew up the budget pretty rapidly. So I think people are tired of being buffeted by these forces. If we get on a track to begin to deal with the new energy economy, which is what we're talking about, we will have a far more stable economy. We'll have lower prices ultimately, and many collateral benefits. For instance, better health, less cancer, less disease, less hospitalization, less complications from COVID or whatever it is for people, and we will also have the ability to have clean, high-paying jobs in new sectors of the economy that emerge as technologies come online. You know, this is going to be one of the biggest economic transformations that we've had, if not the biggest, since the Industrial Revolution. We all saw what happened in the 1990s when high tech came along with telephones that are portable and with desktop computers, et cetera, and it was a revolution. That was a $1 trillion market with 1 billion users, and it was huge. The energy market transition already has 4.5 to 5 billion users. It's going to go up to 10 billion, 9 to 10 in the next 30 years, and it's already the biggest market in the world. So we're looking at an economic transformation that will bring millions of jobs and opportunity. We have to build a grid in America. The building of that grid is going to create unbelievable number of jobs for, you know, electricians and plumbers and engineers and heavy equipment operators and steel workers and others, because it's going to take all of that to build out that grid capacity. Same thing for building out the electric vehicles. You still have steel demands. You still have to build the fundamental vehicle. It's just not going to have an internal combustion engine. It's going to have a battery and fuel cells and so forth. That's the new future. And in the build out of that new future, our economies are actually going to do better than they do today.
Just returning finally to COP26. When you think about the scale of the crisis and the urgency of solving it, do you ever feel anger towards those nations and leaders who are not willing to act?
I feel frustration, and occasionally, you know, I don't think it does any good to get angry about it, but it does good to channel efforts to change it. And sometimes there is frustration in the length of time and the slowness with which, as a world, we have been moving to date. I mean, I understand what Greta and my own kids and other people are deeply frustrated, and it's not inappropriate to be angry about it. You know, I think that on a global basis, people have been put in jeopardy by current practices. And for the last 30 years, we have known how bad it is, 30, 35 years. And still, people are moving too slowly. But it doesn't do you know, I'm not going to get lost in you know, trying to just voice anger. I'm going to try day to day to do my best, which is what I'm doing. And everybody else here is doing. Everybody here is committed to try to do this in an effective way. They're just different views to some degree about how fast they can go or how they can do it. And, you know, I consider myself lucky to be able to be in the middle of that fight. That's you know, not, it's, I don't know. Sometimes I can reserve the anger and scream in the dark, but I'm not going to do it publicly.
Do you view COP26 perhaps as an opportunity for redemption for a generation that failed to tackle the climate crisis?
I haven't thought about it that way, no. But obviously, I mean, are we that bad? Do we just need redemption? I think a lot of good has happened. When I was in college, the extreme poverty rate in the world was over 50%. Today, it's less than 10%. We're curing diseases we never thought we'd cure: smallpox, polio. We have perhaps on the brink of the first generation of children being born AIDS-free in various parts of the world. If you're a woman in the world today and you're pregnant, you're 50% more likely to give birth to your child safely and that child be able to eat and go to school. We're making advances. We're seeing less people die violently today in the world than at any time before in human history. So it's not all negative. And I don't view it as redemption for my generation. We're a generation that marched for civil rights and for human rights and for environment and for women's rights, and we made a difference through the years. Title IX in America has seen us develop a soccer team that's become, you know, the women's soccer team has won the World Cup on numerous occasions. That wasn't possible 20 and 30 years ago in America, at least. So I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to fight for the next step.